Welcome to Gather to Grow here on Twitter Spaces. My name is Dawn Numdu. I'm your host for this evening, and I'm looking forward to tonight's discussion. And we're focusing on how to cut fertilizer cost. Now, this is something that all farmers producing crops, working in the agricultural space, it affects them. And so tonight we're hoping to hear from our speakers and get some insights from them on how to cut costs and what the alternatives are for our food producers in South Africa and in other parts of Africa and globally. What can we be doing to mitigate the cost and make sure that the penny stretches a bit further? Without any further ado, I'm going to ask my speakers to introduce themselves. We have Stephanie Mullins, who's not new to this space. She's been with us on a few sessions, and I'm really happy to have with us. She's a food grower and environmental facilitator. Stephanie, welcome to Gather to Grow. Tell us a bit about yourself. Where did your journey start in agriculture? So we can just get to know who Steph is.
Thanks, Dawn. Hello, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. It's always a pleasure. I love the interactiveness of this platform as well. So I started with my agricultural journey with permaculture, and then I started teaching permaculture, and then I started culture. And my husband and I have an NGO focusing on community work through food gardens.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I should have also invited your husband to this space. I'm sure he would have also had some great insights to share. So thank you so much. And thank you so much for always contributing to this platform. My next speaker is Thapelo Phiri. He is a social innovator helping farmers transition into regenerative agriculture. And this guy, I've met him a while ago. I've featured him on our Farmers Inside Track podcast. He has a lot of expert advice when it comes to fertilizer, and he's a specialist in that field. So welcome, Thapelo. It's great to have you with us. Tell us a little bit about where your journey began and what it's all about.
Thanks for having me, Dawn, and hello to everyone. I'm Thapelo Phiri Jr. I'm a social innovator within the agri space. So part of the things that we currently doing now, it's manufacturing fertilizers because of the issues that we currently facing, climate change, food security, and all the problems that we're currently facing. So I'm part of the few people who believe that in order for us to achieve the sustainable development goals, the main focus has to be agriculture. I'm part of those groups. Thanks.
Thanks so much for joining us, Thapelo. It's great to have you with us. And then my other guest, Thapile Nkonjana. Thapile, he comes through when it comes to, giving us a broad perspective as an agricultural economist working at the National Agricultural Marketing Council, and his focus is specifically around agro-food chains. Thank you so much for agreeing to be here, Thapile, and it's always great to hear from you. Maybe for those that might not know you, a bit about yourself and where your journey started in agriculture and what you do at the NAMC.
Thanks, Don, and the colleagues. So my name is Thapile Nkonjana. I am an agricultural economist within the agri-food chain unit at the National Agricultural Marketing Council, as you have mentioned. So the journey of me being in that space started when I was still in my fourth year in university. I was doing my undergrad, and then it grew a little bit when I joined the grad school of Stellenbosch. So I've been working with some international organizations, the Agroscopes, and other institutions operating within the African continent. So now I'm currently based with the NMC in Pretoria. Thanks.
Thanks, Thapile. It's always great to have you with us. And then we had two other guests lined up. Unfortunately, something happened on their side, so they're not able to join us. Donald was going to join us. He also owns an agricultural company. And then Daniel De Souza, he also farms in Lelucia, and so he was also going to join us, but unfortunately they're not able to make it anymore. But we have a really strong, group of speakers here tonight, but just apologies from their side as well. And thank them also just for being open to join in the first place. Now, to set the scene, I'd like to start with an explainer on why Mzansi's food producers are really forced to cough up almost double with prices rising daily for fertilizers. Thapile, I'm going to ask you to maybe just give us some context. Can you maybe just talk about, why we are spending so much on fertilizer?
The issue with the fertilizers, it started sometime when we began to have issues with the bigger producers, mainly from the European Union and the North American countries, the likes of the Canadians and the US. So that has to do with the primary production of the components that are being used, particularly when we saw some drastic increases, particularly for natural gases, natural gas is something that is used like extensively. It's a little bit above 60% of the components that are used to produce fertilizer, and also the issues with the oils, generally the energy production. So those are some of the things that where we began to see some drastic increases in fertilizer because that affected the production of it. So it had to come down to all of the countries that are buying fertilizer, including South Africa and other net importers globally. So that was the main issue that sort of pushed the global prices up, and that's something, of course, we have seen. Some prices are currently and some 700% up from the prices that we have seen. For an example, last year, I've seen numbers from Yara International. So those guys also, they've mentioned the issues that I've just mentioned, that the gas prices, the other components that are used to produce these fertilizers are ridiculously expensive. And also now that forced them to reduce their production. And of course, if top producer of fertilizer is to reduce their production by 50%, it is going to definitely have a knock-on effect to the global market. And that, of course, it includes Russia, which is the biggest fertilizer producer globally. They've reported at the end of June that their export this year are going to be 25 to 30% lower than the normal volumes that we have seen in previous years. So those are like significant issues that impacted fertilizer prices. And I think that's something that we'll probably continue to see, which is why some countries have actually approached Nigeria to produce, to see after we've seen, I think there was an announcement by one of the richest guys in Africa, in Nigeria, mentioned that they're going to be producing that. So those are some of the things in a nutshell that sort of pushed the global prices up. Of course, that includes South Africa.
Thanks, Tabile. The way I'm understanding it from what you're explaining is that most people thought that it was specifically linked to the war between Russia and Ukraine, but the process actually happened before that, and that's some context that you'd given us, even in your article that was published on Food for Mzansi, about the prices rising.
The issue with the fertilizer, I think for now, we're still going to see a bit of price issues, particularly now that we are going to plant the likes of maize in October. So those maize, particularly in South Africa, it is the biggest consumer of the fertilizer that we buy. In general, the other commodities that we are also going to be buying, we're going to be producing towards the end of this year. Given the current circumstances, it looks like we're going to still see some ridiculous prices compared to what we have seen previously. And of course, that for farmers, it is going to have to be a serious issue, particularly for those that do not, have the bigger wallets, and the commercial farmers that have been within the industry that have sort of managed to play around the fertilizer game. So for other farmers, particularly those that are developing, I think for them, it's going to be a relatively even bigger issue, particularly if you look into the African continent at large, because we have smallholder farmers there. That is why I think it is probably going to be an issue more for them, perhaps if they can look for other alternatives in terms of what they can use as compared to the commercialized one that are made mechanically and all that. I think that will assist them greatly.
Thanks, Tabile. Now, just to get the conversation going around, what the alternatives are, I think you've given us great context in terms of what the situation is. And maybe we can talk about why South Africa imports so much of its fertilizer a bit later. Maybe I want to get more into the nitty-gritty about what are the options for farmers who want to explore producing their own fertilizers, and what are the main components to start the process. Tapelo, can I ask to maybe kick us off with this question, and then Stephanie can also add to that.
When it comes to alternatives, I believe that anything that is renewable can be used as fertilizer. So we're looking into the space of called the circular economy, where now we can have organic fertilizers from food waste, decaying plants, and animal waste. So that's one big opportunity that we need to tap into, maybe as innovators and as farmers, because now with the current issue of fertilizers and the current laws that are coming to play to try to reduce the nitrogen usage within agriculture, I think the space within organic fertilizers will be the next big thing for farmers, and looking into soil health as well, the impact on the environment. So for me, I have no doubt that the next big thing within agriculture is the circular economy.
Thanks so much. I definitely think that a lot of, what farmers are gearing towards is more about focusing on farming more sustainably and for the future. Stephanie, as a permaculturalist and also in the work that you're doing, what are the options for farmers and what should they be thinking about even when they're trying to figure out where to save costs when it comes to fertilizers?
I think that there's no real hard and fast rule. It depends on what you're farming, where you're farming, how big or small your operation is. I would say that start with what you have. It might be very daunting to change from a chemical to a natural process, but if you look at the long-term benefits of it, it's definitely going to save you cost. It might in the beginning be a little bit more time consuming, but as you streamline and mainline your processes, it will be much easier to kind of manage your systems. So there are various systems and it depends on what kind of you have, where you are, and what you're farming. But you can look at things like K&F, which is Korean natural farming, composting, worm farming, using your animal manures, using your weeds that you harvest from your plantation or your possibilities are just really endless. And one thing that is a big game changer for specifically growing naturally fertilizers is your effective microorganism. Once you add that to your soil, you are building for success to invite all the good germs and microorganisms that make soil your plants healthy through feeding your soil.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. This is specifically what I wanted to touch on my next point. Is producing organic fertilizers the way to go for farmers to kind of reduce their dependence on chemical inputs? And how does this, increase our drive within the agricultural sector to farm more sustainably? Tabile, would you guys like to take this question? Maybe also like to focus on how does one practically do that? If I'm used to using chemical fertilizers, how do I make the decision to slowly move towards organic fertilizers, and what should I be thinking about? Tapelo, I'd like to ask you to maybe contribute, seeing that you do help farmers, transition into regenerative agriculture.
When we're looking into the different types of agriculture, we're looking into the conventional farming, which is the traditional way of which most of the farmers are still into. Then there is sustainable agriculture. Then there is regenerative agriculture. So when we talk about transition in agriculture, we mean from degenerative, sustainable to regenerative. So it's a process whereby we start small, depending on what does the farmers have. Then we transition by the first thing that we're looking into is building the soil. So we try to remove the nitrogen usage and all the chemicals within the farming processes. Then we go into no-till, which normally we do at the later stages. But it's one thing that we're trying to push. But the only problem is that it has to be on the governmental level or maybe at the national level. On that space, we will need a strong political will to say this is the direction where the whole agriculture space has to take, because we can see with energy, everyone is talking about solar, everyone is talking about the transition to clean energy, but no one is talking about decarbonizing the industrial space of which we are in, which is the agri-space. There is very slow transition, but we're looking into big companies now, such as McCain, we're looking into the Unilever and the Nestle, which are global companies that are now focusing into more regenerative approaches, even for those who are producing for them. As much as these big companies are moving into regenerative space, we will also need the will from the government to bring in incentives for farmers so that they can move into that space, because it will be one area where a lot of opportunities will be there. We're looking into the carbon credits as well. So if your farmlands cannot sequester carbon, which means you cannot qualify for carbon credits, we're looking into adaptation and mitigation of climate change. So there will be climate finance as well. But that will also need farmers to position themselves into good spaces, be willing to move into that direction so that when the time comes for those opportunities, no one is left behind.
Thanks, Tabelo. And this is a big question, and I'm going to put it out there, and the farmers can either respond or not respond. Do we need incentives to think about the environment and being more cognitive of the fact that we need to start farming with nature and not against it? I don't want to be devil's advocate here, but why are we talking about incentives? As farmers, and at least the farmers that I engage with, that's like top of mind these days. I hear you, Tabelo, so I'm not going to hound on that too much. Tabile, what is your take on this, especially around how do we start shifting our thinking? We focus so much about it on our Farmers Inside Track podcast, talking specifically about carbon credits. That's what Tabile mentioned. How do farmers get carbon credits, for example? Do they even know how to do it? What are the steps? That's another form of income. So Tabile, I'll give you the floor, and then I see one of our listeners also wants to engage. But Tabile, over to you.
I think this brought important issue or aspect of all this thing. If the states or like global world is to win against this, the bigger companies, they're the ones that are to drive this. Because if I'm a farmer, I want to see my yields go up. I want to be able to get more of what I'm producing, because that means for me, I'm going to get some nice profits out of that. So I think only yesterday I saw something from Germany. I think farmers are from Hungary as well. A couple of countries in Europe now, they are busy fighting the policy that has been brought in that to reduce carbon emission by 30%, and also livestock production as well, like particularly for that of a cattle, because those things they had to do with the carbon footprint and all that. So as for farmers, that's why I was saying it has to come from the bigger companies that are producing all this fertilizer and stuff to ensure that they cater for those. Because me, if I'm a farmer, I want to get something that is going to make sure that I'm increasing my yields. I don't think it necessarily matters if it comes from the mechanized fertilizers or organic ones. But if I think that we are to increase the production of those organic fertilizers, and then of course we're going to be in a position to meet the demands, because at the moment one of the reasons we are seeing a lot of increases in fertilizers because agricultural production is expanding drastically in all countries, including South Africa. Therefore, we need more fertilizers to produce all those lands that we are expanding for our production. And therefore, the bigger companies need to come through. Of course, the head of states, they're going to have to be strong as well, because as I was saying, that now farmers in Europe, they are just doing the most because they feel like their production is threatened. And me as a farmer, I just want to see my yields going up, because that for me talks to what I'm going to sell next year. I think for farmers, there's also, of course, going to be a lot of work to be done in terms of conscientizing them, the entire issues, because like now, almost all regions, China is going on flames because of the heat, the drought. Europe is the same thing. Several countries in Southern Africa next to our borders. So these are things that are a reality, whether one believes in it or not. But we are seeing all these things, and it's going to take farmers an effort from them, because they are somehow the drivers. Particularly agriculture is one of the biggest producers of all the gases that are messing up a couple of things.
Thanks, Tabile. And I'd love to hear from the farmers in the space. What do you think about it? Does it affect you? Are you thinking about the next 100 years, 50 years? Let's bring it closer, 10 years from now. And are you cognitive of how you're farming and how it will affect the next generation or 2 generations down the line? Let's bring Stephanie into the conversation. As a food producer, what do you think about? Is it your responsibility as a food producer, as a farmer, as an agriculturalist to continuously advocate for this? And what should we be thinking about?
Yeah, I really liked your thought-provoking question on playing devil's advocate. And I think the reason why we got into the mess of chemical production is because it was started with incentivizing that kind of growth. So now kind of reverting the problem back to we'll incentivize organic growth, I would say is a nice kind of incentive for farmers. And not only do we focus on food gardens, home gardens, but we also do speak to farmers in and around our spaces. One of the things that always comes up in conversation is that farmers are under a lot of pressure to produce and to feed the world. So if I need to wait another 3 years for my soil to be ready to start producing the yield that I'm producing now with chemicals, it's going to take a lot more from my pocket and from my will to produce. So lots of farmers hardly ever take home a paycheck because you're paying everybody, and by the time it's time for you to get your half of feeding the nation, I mean, there's not really much left for you. So that's just a side note. But I think an holistic approach is welcome by most people, and it's not just beneficial for the farmers, for the soil, but then it's also beneficial for the community. It's beneficial for the workers who are applying the chemicals, because there are a range of studies that show that these chemicals, artificial chemicals, are harming not just the environment, but the person applying them as well. So yes, I think having more holistic would encourage our economy to think more greener, if you will.
Thanks for that, Stephanie. And I'm sorry if I trailed the conversation a bit. I hope that you guys are okay with that. And please, if you guys want to engage, please do click the mic. I see Greenbin SA is also in as a listener in this space. They're a food waste management company, and I actually thought it'd be really cool to talk about their concept and what they do. Also talking about the whole issue of sustainability and climate change and where our waste goes. So I'd like to maybe also invite them to grab the mic and join the conversation. But in the meantime, just to go back to producing fertilizers and what the alternatives are. Does scale matter if you're a new farmer with a small hold or a commercial producer on a mega farm? Is the concept and practice to produce your own fertilizer the same thing? Tapelo, would you like to take this one? Or Steph, I see you've unmuted your mic.
I just have a comment. So I think, yes, it does matter on your size, but small solutions. So don't do your entire 100-acre farm in one go. Start small spaces and then slowly start converting it to organic. And that's my 5 cents.
Thanks, Steph. Thanks for that. Tapelo, what would you like to add a comment or respond to the question?
Size does matter when it comes to the issue of using organic fertilizers. So, for example, if you're having a 10-hectare land, the size of fertilizers that you will need, you might find them available. But if you have maybe 500 hectares or even 100 hectares of land, the size of fertilizers that you'll need will be huge. I think that's when now the opportunities start to arise for innovators to tap in that space and find ways on how they can produce more with less. So yes, size does matter.
Thanks for that, Tapelo. Greenbin SA has grabbed the mic. Maybe just to introduce yourselves before I move on with my questions, more about your company, what you do, just telling us more about where the concept started and everything about what you guys do at Greenbin SA.
Thanks so much, Dawn. Good to speak to you again. Good evening to everybody else. Greenbin SA, we concentrate on food waste management. And I think where we fit in here is really talking about reducing our carbon footprint and doing things differently. So what we do is we collect food waste from residents and from commercial. And I don't know if you know how much of food waste we accumulate over time. I'm talking about inedible food. So from your food prep, wastage on plates, anything that's going old that needs to be thrown, we don't want it to actually go to landfill because it causes methane gas emissions there. So what we actually do is we collect all of that food waste. We're a service because we understand that people don't have the capacity to do that for themselves. They don't have the space to do it, and they also don't have the know-how to do it. So what we've done is created a service where we can collect all of this food waste and we turn it into organic compost. And the big aim for us, obviously we're fairly new and we still need to get a lot more clients in order to produce enough organic compost to start supplying the farms. And I just want to touch on what Stephanie was saying earlier about changing the way we think and looking at it holistically. So moving forward, we also do need to think about how we do things differently. How do we reduce our costing? How do we reduce our impact on climate? How do we actually produce more organic fruits and vegetables? Whatever we're farming, how do we actually produce that more organically? And what we'd like to do eventually is to produce enough compost so we can supply all of these farms. I think, Tabila, you were talking about the fact that you just need so much at a farm. You need lots of space and you need a huge amount of fertilizer onto the farms. And this is where we want to get to. But I'm just thinking for farmers on this platform, is this not something that you can look at doing? The clients that we approach, like the big commercial players, a lot of them say that they're sending all of this food waste off to pig farmers, whereas you can also get into the space and collect it and produce your own organic compost. Would that be something that you could look at, moving towards reducing the amount of chemicals that you're putting onto your farms?
Definitely. Thank you so much for that. And that is, of course, Sumitra Naidu. She's the founder of Greenbin SA. And really great to have you with us and great suggestions. I think this is a very innovative space for people to engage and think about different ideas of how they operate their businesses on a day-to-day basis. Another aspect and something that we've actually spoken about on our Farmers Inside Track podcast, and we have a guide on food from Zanzi, is specifically focused on vermiculture or vermicomposting, which is a simple way of turning your waste into your own fertilizer. Now, the expert featured on this episode was Divitso Chizingeni, and he's an animal scientist and a farmer in Harare, Zimbabwe, and he kind of just shared the ins and outs on this. But maybe for the speakers here tonight, do you agree that organic waste is definitely what Sumitra even said? What people are throwing away is actually a gold mine of nutrients that we should be using to grow our crops. So what do you guys think? Tabile, maybe you can take this one. And Tapelo, you can also contribute. Steph, I see you already have your mic unmuted. Tabile?
This is such an important topic in general. Of course, I mean, the issue of wastage is actually something that has always been there. But I think now it is kind of it's something that the situation that the world sees itself, it is forcing everyone that is involved on it, particularly the farmers, to understand the importance of using organic fertilizers. But as I was saying earlier on, that I think that the scale of our production of changing the conventional way of doing agriculture is going to be important. So I think this is one thing that the continent specifically and the East Asian countries where we still have a lot of the subsistence and emerging farmers. I think this is a concept that would easily fit in there in terms of the sizes of the fertilizer that is required. And also it is very important because, I mean, it just fixes the soil. It's actually something that should not be emphasized for the general public to understand it. It is practical. It's something that has always been there. So it's a very important topic and issue that should be looked into. And also for the innovators, they will just do a lot. I mean, it's an opportunity for the continent, as I was saying earlier on, but unfortunately, we still see a lot of massive investment to the conventional production of fertilizers, which is something that I think is not necessarily said, but it would be of an advantage for the guys that want to get into the production space and to just focus on organic fertilizer. I mean, the more we do it, the better we're going to get into it, and also the expansion in production, which I think is going to be a critical issue going forward, because we have the bigger commercial farmers that are the ones that are feeding the world. Now, if we are to say, let's reduce this, it's going to talk to how much of food that we're going to get. And that is something that I think we don't want at the moment, because the rate of population growth, particularly for the AG countries and Africa, the ones that I've just mentioned, it is just ridiculous. So we're going to need all that food that we can get.
Thanks, Tabile. It does sound like we're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place with this, because I think there's this big movement around sustainability and focusing on climate change, but the wheel is just not turning fast enough. Tapilo, what do you think? And also, I'd like to maybe get into the basics of more specifically vermicomposting for people who'd like to get into it, and maybe just explaining the steps for farmers to explore. Tapilo, would you like to take this one?
I think when it comes to turning food waste into fertilizers, the biggest issue is scaling. How much can you supply? We could have went to food composting as well as a company, but we realized that there will be a lot of resources that we will need if we want to turn food waste into fertilizers. That's why we went into chicken manure, turning chicken manure into fertilizers. So it became a bit easier for us because we are able to scale up. So for example, for 40 hectare land, you only use 1 liter of fertilizer because you can mix it or dilute it into 1,000 liters. So those are some of the things that we need to look into while we look into this circular economy and the opportunities that are coming, that we need to answer the question of scale. Can we scale up to supplying maybe 10,000 hectares of land at the frequently or whenever the fertilizer is needed? Can we be able to supply that demand? That's where the question begins. So the problem that I see with a lot of companies into this organic space, it's the problem of scaling. They don't have the resources to scale up their production. So it becomes a question of, do you guys want to push this organic stuff or not? The answer is yes, but we don't have the know-how, we don't have the resources. So hence I was saying earlier that we need strong political will from the government. The corporate cannot do much without the government involvement, and the policies will have to come from the government to say, now we're moving into this direction, look into these spaces, the circular economy, ESG. This is where everything is going. This is where the world is going. So the government has to give a mandate to the corporate, then entrepreneurs, then will tap into that space. And one other thing, when it comes, there are easy ways to go around it, but it also depends on the size of the land that you have. If you have large sum of land, it will require more resources. But for starters, if you have maybe half an hectare or a hectare, then it can be a bit easier for you. You can go around having your compost beds and you can grow for that season. But for the bigger farmers now, it becomes a question of resources. Can we supply them? Can we be able to scale up the production? So I think it goes back and forth. back and forth.
Yeah, I hear you. And I see, Smitra, I was about to come to you in terms of, what you experienced with the company that's doing this. Is this your reality?
I absolutely agree with Tapelo. I think that's one of our biggest issues. It's our big challenge is getting buy-in and also the policy around it. And I think it is coming. It's very slow. In a few years' time, it will be mandated that food waste needs to be collected and decomposed correctly just on the carbon footprint side. But I think Tapelo is right. It's very expensive for us to do this. The reason that we are charging for the service is really just to manage all of our operating costs, costs money to do this. Also, you need to have land in order to do it. So right now, we want to scale up. We can't scale up because we need money to buy land. We don't have any big companies that are coming on board. They either want to try and do it themselves or they're reluctant to get into the space because it's not mandated right now. It's not part of regulation. So people are avoiding it. And they probably will continue to avoid it for a long time until it becomes mandatory. So I think these are the major issues until we actually get buy-in and people start changing the way they do things, the way they're thinking, and insist on making a change when it comes to climate. Even the farming will be impacted. It will be different. But I think scaling up is our biggest challenge right now because we just don't have the resources.
Yeah, it is a very difficult place to be in. I think for me, and with much respect to all the farmers present, the biggest buy-in should be from our producers. Stephanie, what do you think on this point? I see we have one of our listeners wanting to join the conversation. Precious, I'm going to give you a chance to speak in a moment. I see you just connecting as a speaker. But Stephanie, what do you think?
Well, I agree. And mostly the expertise of government and structures, that's not where I lie. I think about the decomposers, and the decomposers are the worms, and just about the vermicomposting. I mean, yes, you need space, you need resources to scale up, but all you need for a worm farm is your worms, and they're specific worms. They are called red wrigglers, and it can be as easy as putting it in an old bathtub and then collecting the urine and the worm compost on top. Could be as simple as just having crates and letting them live in horse or animal manure. So I'm speaking from a perspective of the decomposers of the natural environment. And I think definitely if we incorporate worms in our systems, they can definitely help not only with giving us outputs with fertilizers for their urine and their poop, but they also get rid of our waste as well. And they also create air pockets in our soil. So I think they are amazing little creatures.
Thanks, Stephanie. I think we must have a whole nother discussion on that. Precious, you have the floor just to introduce yourself first, and then you can add your comment or question to our speakers.
Evening, everyone. I'm so happy for the platform with the conversation. I think it's absolutely important, and listening to everybody saying their piece, it sounds like it affects us differently, those who are inputs business and those who are actually producing. I think for those who are farming, especially small farmers, I think it's much more easier for them to try and rehabilitate, to turn the waste of some sort if they're collecting, or if it's like old crops on the farm. They can dedicate, like, let's say a hectare and then work on that. There's a video I think about Z2 where they do the same thing. They have dedicated plots where they just till the soil and then add organic matter, then irrigate that part for years and years or months, whatever the case may be. And when they need such material to go plant or to go use as fertilizer, they then go dig out that specific dedicated place for rehabilitating their soil so that they can have more natural organic fertilizer. So I think that's very awesome. And for farmers, I think they should go and explore with that and find other creative ways, more organic ways of growing their vegetables. As for people like Tapelo and I think Green Bean and the guys who are in the inputs business, is definitely going to be difficult. I think their biggest job is to educate the rest of the farmers about the importance of turning to organic products. I think that's going to be very helpful for everyone.
Thanks, Precious, and it's great to hear from you and get your perspective. Give me an essay, Sumitra.
I'm just interested hearing Precious as well and everybody else speaking on here. I don't know. I'd like to hear from the farmers. Sorry, I'm not meaning to sell what we do on this platform. I'm just interested to know whether any farmers are actually doing any of their own composting. because we do actually go out and we teach people how to do it for themselves. So they have it on site and they can use it. Whether it's purely organic composting using no worms, not that the worms are not organic, but you can do either that or you can do the vermicomposting, right? So I'm just interested to know if any of the farmers on this platform, any of them actually have or know how to do the composting on site.
Thanks, Sumitra. I'm going to open up the floor. If you'd like to say yes or no, or you can react. I'm going to maybe start picking on farmers that I know in this space. I see Eric Mawane is here, some of the regulars on Gather to Grow. If you just like to grab the mic and just say yes or no, or whether you're interested or not interested, it's something that you're thinking about. I think the fact that you're here listening in is a start. And I think that's an indication, perhaps, Sumitra, as to, farmers actually wanting to know more about how they can do it. I specifically wanted to ask about the cost involved to be able to do what you're saying, to be able to produce your own compost. What should you kind of keep in mind? Is it land, like you're saying, Sumitra? Is it worms that you need to buy? Is it the structures? What are the basics? Tapela, I'm not sure if you want to take this, or Sumitra, you can also take it.
Just to answer that, we don't use the worms because I found when we did use the worms are quite fussy. So you can't just put anything in there. They basically need to have clean vegetables. They also need a dark space. They need to be moist. So there's a lot more care that you need to exercise when you're working with worms. We use bokashi and we break that down. For us, our biggest cost is actually labor. But what we've done is we've managed to employ more people. So we want to keep it completely manual. We don't use any machinery, any technology. We actually have quite a few employees, staff that actually turn all of this food waste and get it to a point where it's good enough. It's all broken down and it can be used, whether it's in small scale farming or large scale farming. So, if we collect food waste in a week, it will take us up to a month to turn all of that into organic compost. So it's quite labor intensive. So that would be our biggest costing, is managing staff to do that.
Thanks so much. And that's, of course, one way of doing it. Tiffany and then Tabile, and I see Tapela also unmuted his mic.
I love all kind of decomposing methods. Yes, composting, just putting all your greens, your browns, and then mixing them up is definitely one of the best ways to turn your waste into something usable for your soil. But from a personal perspective, the most cost would be possibly your time, is setting up your systems and then collecting all your resources and taking them to another space. And then also the space. So space, depending on whether I'm a small scale backyard gardener or a large scale farmer, I'm going to need space. So those are two of the main implements, and then obviously the hands. But depending on how efficient and effective you make your systems, they could be quite manageable for up to 2 people for a medium scale setup. But yes, I absolutely love any form of decomposing which contributes to the health of our soil.
Thanks, Stephanie. Tabile?
There's one thing that I'm getting in all our discussions here in terms of how do we make sure that we achieve the goal that we're all talking about here, that is to do some damage in terms of producing the compost and all that. I think it's going to go back to, much as we have heard that, at least from a couple of speakers, the governments, they have to be on board on all this. I think that's very important. But at the same time, I also want to just make an example about the issue of electricity now. At one point, electricity was a joke for South Africa only as a country because it was struggling with electricity generation and all that. But if I'm to tell you now, only today in China, some offices, they are no longer using the air conditioners and all that. In Europe, France, as much as they did have some larger reserve and all that, at the moment they are going through hellish. Germany is going back to coal mines and nuclear plants that were abandoned some time ago. The issue with that is not necessarily the failure of the state, but of course it's also not to invest properly. Investment is not necessarily done by the states or the governments. It is done by the corporates, the same guys that are producing the fertilizer that we are using now. So I think it is crucial that this thing is talked like at the right platforms where the right folks get in to understand the importance of this, and then the right investments should be directed towards the right direction in terms of reserving the land that we are using. and all other stuff that we want to use and prolong its lifespan. I think that's one thing for me, it stands out. It's going to be important to bring in the corporates. They are the ones that have money to invest. I mean, we are talking about, even in South Africa now, the master plan. It's a typical example where we have seen the state coming together with the private sector to work on something that at least we want to anticipate to benefit everyone. Until we do that at the larger scale, including the topic that you're talking about, the governments, they can have the policies, they can be nice at point, but I think the bigger issue, it is bringing in the right folks, the corporates, as I was saying, innovators, to make sure that they understand this. And then that's only when we're going to be in a position to bring in the necessary capacity that we need to expand all this that we want.
Agreed 100%, Tabile, and I'm hoping that even through this conversation, this can be a start to many more to follow. Having the conversation with all who's present is also very important. Small contribution, but a contribution nonetheless. Tapelo, your comments, and then I see Eric Mawane is also here. Eric, I'll give you the space after this.
Depends on what scale one wants to go around this production. So for me, we needed a lot of money to start a plant with bioreactors. We needed access to the lab, and luckily we got one lab in Hartis that we're working with. So for us, the most important thing is to make sure the trace element or the nutritional content of our product doesn't change. To do that, it requires a lot of resources. And luckily now, we have found ways on how we can take down the cost of production. So it could be one other way for other innovators within the space to look into the consistency. If you say today your product has 30% nitrogen, tomorrow it's 35, so that's not constant. That's where a lot of money will go into research and development, the technologies that will help you to have a constant production criteria or whatever that may be. Then it will require a lot of sampling as well, so that to make sure that the standard remains the same, the quality remains the same. You'll also need someone who will do quality assurance on your side so that everything runs well. So it takes a lot of resources. It requires a lot of resources. It requires a lot of research and development. Just requires a lot of resources. So if you tap into the space, you need to tap into the space knowing that it will require a lot of resources. Do you have those resources? If the answer is no, you should look into partnerships and collaborations. You can have an access to a lab. You don't need to buy a lab. If you have access to the lab, then you are fine. Then at least you are moving somewhere. If you don't have resources, look into who can you partner with for what and how can that relationship grow over time, because it will require a lot of resources to scale. It took us 3 years to be able to produce 10,000 liters. Now we can produce up to 50,000 liters with no problem in 21 days. To get to this point, it has taken a lot of everything from us, but we needed to continue moving, building those partnerships, building those relationships with people who have more resources than us, people who have more know-how than us. So it does work with collaborations.
Thanks, Tapelo. And just on that point, out of interest sake, maybe I should have made it one of my questions. Does organic compost cost more than chemical compost fertilizer? How does it work? Tapelo, you can respond to it before I go to Eric. Because I'm thinking if someone has to pay more for something that was produced organically, are they going to? I don't know.
When it comes to the cost, obviously the organic stuff, it's way cheaper than the chemicals. And reason being, when you're using organic stuff, with time you use less and less. When you're using chemicals, with time you're using more and more. So most of the money goes into producing the same quality and the same quantity, but each and every year you need to top up the money when using the chemicals. On the organic side, with each and every year you're reducing on the cost, you're increasing on the quality and the quantity of the produce. That's the main difference between the two.
Okay, thank you so much. As someone that knows nothing about it, I understood it perfectly. Eric Mawane, you're welcome to grab the mic and share your comments, or maybe even respond to Sumitra's question.
Good evening to everyone, and thanks. I think on my side, it's more to thank the speakers for the knowledge they've shared tonight. I think it's also food for thought for commercial farmers like ourselves. I mean, one of the burning where we're spending a whole lot of money on our farm, and also on the farmers that I'm currently mentoring, it's more on fertilizer. We're currently cracking our head on looking at better ways to save cost, at the same time to still continue to produce the highest quality that we've been producing for years. I'll definitely keep in touch with a couple of yours and explore this even further. You've sort of asked the question that I wanted to ask was basically on the cost issue of the current system we're currently using of the chemical versus the organic. So I think it's worth exploring, worth reserving a portion of some land and run trial and see where this is taking us. But it's a big thank you to your speakers and to yourself, Don, for organizing this.
Thanks so much, Eric. And it's always great hearing from you and having you on the space. This is exactly why I love this platform, guys. I spoke to a farmer earlier today who asked for someone's number that was featured on another Gather to Grow episode. And I was like, yay, that's a win for me. If I can connect to people, that's a win for me. So thank you so much, Eric. And thanks so much to my speakers. We've run out of time, but I maybe want to talk about the challenges and then just overall benefits for farmers and the untapped opportunities. I'm going to start with Stephanie.
Possibly the challenges you will face is your setup. You can learn so much online and they are pretty simple. So I think incorporating many different forms of organic fertilizers increases your chance of boosting the life in your soil.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. Precious, I'm not sure if you want to say something as well, but I'll also give you a chance to give a comment. I think what you said earlier was also so valuable as a farmer. Dimitra from Greenbin SA, and then final word then from Tabile.
So I think the challenges that we have here is obviously scaling up, and I think it works both ways. So the challenge for farmers is that they need to have enough compost and enough fertilizer for their farming needs. Equally, you need somebody to supply that. And I think for a lot of people that are doing composting, whether it's vermicomposting or other composting, we need to be able to scale up in order to supply that. It's totally understandable for a farmer not to be able to just switch off from the chemical fertilizers that they're using right now, because they do need something there. So if you don't have enough supply coming through of anything organic, then you can't exactly switch off, because then you don't produce whatever it is that you're producing. So I think the challenge for us as composters is that we need to find the resources, we need to find the funding, we need to be able to scale up in order to meet farmers' needs so that they can move on to producing organically. Moving forward, I think it's very doable if you have farm space already, if you have land, it's very doable to actually set up your own composting so that you can supply your own need. And that with a little bit of know-how. Research and development obviously does come at a cost, but composting is fairly easy and information is freely available. It's just about getting that little know-how and setting that up on your farm. It's very doable.
Thank you so much, Dimitra. And of course, guys, slide into the DMs. Don't be scared. Message people. This space will be available on Food for Mzansi's YouTube channel after this. We'll also have a detailed article focusing on some of the main points that the speakers contributed. You can even contact me, if you'd like to know more. Dawn Numdu, I'm your host every week on this space. Tabile, over to you.
We are to do some serious research around this. The lady from Greenbin SA has mentioned that also, as Tabile earlier on. We're going to have to do some serious research in terms of coordinating the agricultural sector at large. I mean, if you talk of the livestock industry, for example, that's the biggest in South Africa. I mean, if we can do some serious research around that and how to link the issue of moving into organic fertilizer production, because those two, they go hand in hand. I think we will have to come up with some very creative ways. And that is something that I think is going to be important. But of course, the research and some serious investments in it, which is something I think that the state now has realized is important. And they are doing a bit of upscaling in terms of the funding to do that. I think that will be a first step and also a movement to a right direction.
Thanks, Tabile. Tapelo, are you able to just say the last word or comment, just in terms of the opportunities for farmers?
I believe the biggest opportunities now for farmers are into the organic food, because now it seems like the consumers are starting to vote with their rands. So halfway, the consumers will dictate where the market will go. So if you want to tap into the organic space, obviously, as a producer, you need to start now and start looking into those retail spaces. Big corporate companies like McCain, they have those opportunities. Nestle, they offering those opportunities, but it will take farmers to tap into those spaces. So there are a lot of opportunities for farmers within the organic space, within the circular economy space. They continue to open up because not so long, the JSE was communicating to say there will be climate finance for farmers, but it will take farmers who are already positioned into those spaces.
Thanks so much for your final comment. I see there's a tweet that came through from Jeff Tando, I hope I'm saying that right, with liquid fertilizers versus normal fertilizer, which one costs less? That's the last question I'm going to put to the floor as we wrap up. I think, Tapelo, you were responding to this earlier, but maybe you can just give your response again for the question that was raised by one of our listeners.
Okay, when you have compared between the granular fertilizers and the liquid fertilizers, I think that's where we started to come. If you had to fertilize 50 hectares of land using granular, how much fertilizer would you need? The same size of land, you're using a liter and something of our fertilizer, having 1,000 liters in each 1 liter bottle. So it's a question of how much do you have in terms of resources. So if you have to use the granular fertilizer in a larger space, you will need more and more and more because they are granular. You cannot do anything. They are in that granular form. But if it's liquid, you can expand it to like a space. So the liquid fertilizers are cheaper.
Okay, thanks for that, Tapelo. And I think maybe there's an opportunity for us through our Farmers Inside Track podcast and the articles that we publish weekly to maybe go into more detail with this. We have featured both Tapelo and Tabile and Greenbin Essay on our podcasting channel, focused specifically on this topic. But I think there's a part 2 needed, more of a how-to in detail explainer for farmers. If you agree, just react and I'll organize it. In the meantime, I'm wrapping up this evening session. Thank you